wish we could all get together in person, but it's so fun seeing your names pop up in our list of attendees, and so many familiar names, friends of the Wildlife Federation, and some new folks too, and that's we love to see that as well. So welcome everyone to our webinar on monarchs, and we will also talk about their migration and the milkweed that they depend on. So I'm going to jump right in here. I've got a lot to share with you today. So habitat destruction is always something that we are talking about here at the Wildlife Federation, because it is one of the main factors that is leading to most species decline. Whether it's from pollution, taking down of trees to build roads and shopping centers and such. So we have programs, we partner with the National Wildlife Federation and other affiliates like us around the country to encourage people to recreate and enhance the habitat right in their own backyard, at their schoolyard, at a local park or business, industries, even whole communities. So we have more information about how you can do that for all different types of wildlife on our website, and then we'll dive in a little bit today about monarchs in particular. Pollinators, of course, monarchs are included in that, as well as bees, other butterflies besides monarchs, moths, and other insects, and also hummingbirds and bats are even pollinators. And pollinators have been in the news a lot over the last few years because their populations have been declining, and they're so important for our world's food supply. So there's lots of factors that are affecting all sorts of pollinators, especially habitat destruction, other types of insecticides that are killing them off. So one thing that especially affects monarchs is climate change, because they do migrate, and so they depend on having the plants that they depend on. They need to have those plants in bloom and leafed out at the right time when they're migrating. So it is a big factor for them. It also affects the forests where they live in Mexico, which we'll talk about soon. So this graph shows kind of just the overall decline of monarchs in particular over the last 20 years or so. And you can see here that the way that they count monarchs is by the total area where they overwinter in Mexico. And so you can see there's a lot of variation there. And having been to these sanctuaries in Mexico, I can tell you that they're very remote. And so I wonder if some of the fluctuation is due to sometimes there might be monarchs overwintering in areas that we haven't seen them at, or they haven't seen them at in Mexico. So some of that is affected by that, and also weather patterns and that kind of thing. But you can see an overall downward trend, which is very concerning, of course. Especially this last winter, there was a lot of news about the western population of monarchs. And it's the same species, but these monarchs do not migrate to Mexico. These are west of the Rockies, and they migrate back and forth from the coast of California into the mountains. So they're separate from the eastern population, and that western population did have a significant decline. So we're not sure how that is related to the rest of the monarch populations around the country. So I want to kind of go through the butterfly life cycle. A lot of us have heard about this before, and just show you some pictures of the monarchs in particular. And of course they start up, well, we have the adults here that are flying around and looking for nectar to drink, and then they will also be looking for their host plant, which is milkweed. And that's where they will lay their eggs. And you can see this adult, the abdomen is curled down towards the leaf, and she is laying eggs there. And the eggs are big enough to see with the naked eye. You can see there's a couple here on these leaves. And then they will hatch out into tiny little caterpillars. And I've put my finger in that picture as well so that you can see the size there. And those caterpillars will eat those milkweed leaves, and then they will shed their skin and continue to grow bigger and bigger as they're consuming the milkweed until they get nice and fat like this one further down here. And when they have reached the right size, they will climb to a nearby shrub or tree, sometimes the side of your house or things like that, and they will attach themselves upside down and kind of curl around in the form of a J here. And this means that they're getting ready to go through the process of metamorphosis. And so the outer skin of the monarchs, these are the different stages here. So it begins to harden, the outer skin hardens, and eventually forms this chrysalis shape. So it's not a cocoon that they spin. Moths have cocoons, and butterflies have the outer skin that hardens into this chrysalis. So after a week or so, a week to 10 days, it will start to turn transparent, and you'll be able to see the butterfly wing through the chrysalis. And then they will emerge, and you can see this chrysalis here on the far left is completely transparent when it had just come out. So, or eclose is what they call it when the butterfly emerges from the chrysalis. So at this point, they are fully formed adults. Their abdomen is very swollen when they first come out. The wings are very crumpled and wet, and they need to hang out right in that same area. They might climb up to the branch and just hang out there for an hour or so while they dry out. They'll pump their wings several times to try to get all the juices flowing through their wings. So that's a really great opportunity to get some really great pictures of them as they're drying out there. So each different species of butterfly has its own host plant or a group of plants that they can lay their eggs on. So on the left here is the black swallowtail butterfly that we have here in South Carolina. And if you have an herb garden, parsley, fennel, and dill are their host plants. So you've probably seen their caterpillars here on your plants, and they will chew every leaf off, but it will come back. So, but it's providing great habitat for the black swallowtails. And then on the right is the Gulf fritillary, the orange one, and the zebra longwing at the bottom. And those both have passion vine there that is their host plant. So they will lay their eggs on those. And I'll show you some pictures of their caterpillars a little bit later. But of course, the monarch's host plant is milkweed. And so there's a nice fat one, close up monarch, so you can really see the detail in the colors and the pattern there. So milkweed has been disappearing over the last several years, especially due to different types of pesticides and herbicides, mostly for the milkweed. And so that has really contributed to the monarch's decline. So one thing we really need to get people to do is to plant more milkweed. So there are about 80 different species of milkweed, and there are several that we have that are native to South Carolina. But this, if you Google Bonap, B-O-N-A-P, and milkweed, you can pull up this information about milkweed species in other parts of the country as well. And you can see where they're located and which species of milkweed it is. So they all start with Asclepias here, And then the different, sometimes we refer to them with the different species, the genus names, species names there to differentiate them. And then I'll also have the common names. Do we have a question, Shannon?
We do, and this actually goes back to the last slide where you were depicting the stages of the butterfly.
Okay.
Wants to know if you could discuss how the caterpillar shed, the shed skin is discarded while the chrysalis stays attached to the branch. She's always found it fascinating, but never really understood how they do it.
Okay. So the caterpillars shed their skin as they're growing from the tiny ones to the larger ones. And it just kind of, it's not like a snake skin. It just kind of falls off with individual scales, I guess, just smaller pieces as they're growing. And as the caterpillar forms its chrysalis, it doesn't shed that outer skin at this point. It just hardens, that skin just hardens into the chrysalis. And I don't know how that happens. That's very very technical, and I'm not sure if scientists even understand all the ins and outs of how they actually form that chrysalis. But it's not shedding, it's just an actual hardening of their outer skin. So I'm going to tell you a little bit now about some of the different species of milkweed that are native to South Carolina. So Asclepias tuberosa is butterfly weed, or butterfly milkweed, sometimes they call it. And you can see on the map here that it's, the dark green shows the states that they're located in, and then the light green shows the areas of the state where it's common. And so this one is common all across South Carolina. And this tuberosa, the butterfly weed, grows about 3 feet tall, so it's not very tall, and has these orange flowers and very slender leaves. And another very common one in South Carolina is the common milkweed, Syriaca, and it has very wide leaves that are sometimes as big as wide as your palm, and their flower clusters are also quite large. And you can see from the map that it doesn't grow naturally in all areas of the state, but it grows very well if you plant it in gardens in most areas of the state. Incarnata, or swamp milkweed, is another milkweed that's native to our state and also grows very well. Of course, with its name, it grows great in wet conditions. We have some in our yard here in the Columbia area, and it's growing great there as well. It has very slender leaves. The common milkweed and this incarnata, the swamp milkweed, they both get taller than the butterfly weed. So they can get even up to 4 or 5 feet tall. So, and they both have those big flower clusters on them. And I should mention the 3 that I've already discussed are relatively easy to find, either through plant nurseries or seeds. And these 3 also we have included in our seed packets that we distribute from the Wildlife Federation. This is another species that is native throughout a lot of parts of our state, but it's not as easy to find in plant nurseries and or as seed packets. And it has really wide leaves like the common milkweed, and also the large flower clusters, but they're white flowers on this one. So that's just a few of our native species. There are several others, and we have a page on our website that lists all of the others as well. This is one that's you might see most often, but it's actually not native, and its common name around here is tropical milkweed. And So because it's not native, it's not one that we recommend. There's been discussion amongst scientists and monarch experts about the possible detriment that it may cause to monarchs. And it grows well here, sometimes can really spread, but because it's not native, there's like a fungus that it could get since it's not native to this area. And there's also discussion about whether it dies back. It doesn't die back early enough, so it might mess up the migration cues for the monarchs. So we always just tell people to plant native if you can. And if you have this in your yard already, I wouldn't necessarily pull it out, but just add some native milkweed around it and maybe phase it out over the years. Another question, Shannon?
Yeah, Pat wants to know if, especially with all that milkweed you mentioned thriving in your yard, if you see monarchs and if it is a perennial.
We do see monarchs. We see a lot of monarchs in all different phases, and I'll show you lots of pictures coming up here. And the monarch or the milkweed reseeds every year, and they get huge seed pods, and I brought a couple for show and tell that I will show you after my slides here so you can see what they look like. And they reseed, the seed pods open up in the fall every year. So if you have seed packets, you can put them out into the fall and they will be there in the ground and then germinate in the spring. So that's the natural cycle of the milkweed seed pods that they distribute. Okay, so here is a map that shows the general migration routes for the monarchs. And if you look over here at California, you can see that's the western population that I mentioned earlier, west of the Rockies, and they just migrate back and forth from the coast up into the mountains there. So that's the population that was in the news this last winter, and it has some really significant declines. And so I'm not sure about the reasons for that or how it is related to this huge eastern population that we have. So all of these monarchs, I shouldn't say all, most of these monarchs in these areas will migrate down through here into Mexico. There are, though, some little arrows over here that show some different routes. And so we're not really sure where the monarchs that come through South Carolina, if they go to Mexico in the winter or where they go. We even have some that stay in South Carolina over the winter, down in the Charleston area, out on some of the beaches and in the marshes, they will overwinter there. So I will talk a little bit about our tagging efforts so we can try to find out exactly where our monarchs here in South Carolina are going. So in 2017, my husband and I took a trek down to Mexico to see the monarch sanctuaries there. And we flew into Mexico City and took a 3-hour cab ride west and stayed at the J.M. Butterfly Bed and Breakfast in Macheros, which is in the state of Mexico, within the country of Mexico. And you can see it's very remote, like I mentioned, very small town there of Macheros. And this little bed and breakfast is really a hidden gem in this town and in this area of the country. And so a few pictures here at the top. This is the main house when you first come in from the road over at this gate. And then there's a big courtyard. I think they've put a pool in there since we went, and then there's a guest house here. Really nice accommodations and super, super sweet hosts of the bed and breakfast. Joel Moreno here on the left is the grandson of one of the men who founded the Monarch sanctuaries in Mexico years ago. And so he's grown up learning about monarchs and working for their conservation. Grown up right there in Macheros. His mama owns and runs the only restaurant in town, which is also fabulous, by the way. So his wife, Ellen, not from Macheros. She's actually from Columbia, South Carolina, went to Drew High School, and now is married to Joel and runs this bed and breakfast. They run it together. And they take the groups that stay there on tours of the sanctuaries. The first sanctuary that we went to was Cerro Pelon, and it was within walking distance from the bed and breakfast. And then the entrance was. So once we got to the entrance, there was a line of horses there and a guide for each horse. And so we all got onto a horse, and then a guide led each horse on this trail up the mountain. And it was about an hour ride on the horse up the mountain. And that's the only way you can get there. You can't go in there by yourself. You have to go in with a guide. And so once we got to the area where the monarchs were, we could look through the trees and see these clusters of monarchs that look like leaves at first glance, and they're just all hanging out there. And I'll zoom in a second and show you some more detail there. But these trees, they are all on oyamel trees, or arbol religioso, which is what they call them in Mexico, or religious tree. And they call them that because the ends of the branches look like a cross. So those are their fir trees, and only grow in these wet mountainous areas in Mexico. So zooming in, you can see into some of those darker, I overexposed this picture so that you could really see the different layers of the monarchs and just how many there were in those trees. And so in those darker shaded areas that you can see in the background of this picture, most of the monarchs are closed up and they're waiting for the sun to warm up the side of the mountain. If you noticed in that picture of me on the horse, I had my coat on. It was cold, but it did warm up during the day. And so when the sun hits the side of the mountain, the monarchs will open their wings and absorb that heat from the sun. So you can see the ones that are in the sun are more, you can see the outside top part of their wings, whereas the ones that are in the shade are more, most of them are more closed up. So just a few more pictures there. So Cerro Pelon, that was the first sanctuary that we went to, and this is the one that was in walking distance from the bed and breakfast. And this one had a few trees like the one that I showed with all the monarchs. There were monarchs flying all around our head the whole time we were there. And since I mentioned you have to be with guides to go in, there was only 12 people in our group, plus the guides. And so when we got off the horses, our guides stayed with the horses, most of the guides, just a couple came with us. So there was only about 14 or 15 of us actually around the monarchs, and it was so quiet. We didn't need this sign here, but you could hear, since the butterflies were flying around our head, you could hear the wing beats, and it sounded like raindrops on the trees. But it was just a really amazing experience, and one that was a very different experience from the other sanctuary that I'll tell you about in a minute. Question?
Yeah, so a lot of people are commenting on the impressive amount of monarchs there are, but one question in particular from Jenny, she wanted to know, do they just hang out there? What are they eating? What are they doing other than waiting for the sun to come out and warm them up?
They do eat. There were lots of wildflowers that were blooming while we were there. And so they do get some nectar. For the most part, they are hanging out. And as it gets closer to the time that they leave, they begin to mate there, and then making the trek back up to across the border and into Texas, so that they can lay eggs, and then they die, and then the next generation continues the migration.
There you go. You just answered the next question.
Okay. All right, so at the end of each day at the bed and breakfast, this is Joel here embracing the sunset. Joel and Ellen will have a campfire in the courtyard there. And while we were there, all the guests would come out to the campfire and talk about their different experiences and just talk about how much everybody loves monarchs. And so it was just a really neat experience. It is Mexico, so there is also like tequila and cerveza and stuff. So anyways, but it's just a wonderful place to stay. So I can't say enough about that. So the next day we went to El Rosario Sanctuary. And this was, as I mentioned, a very different experience from Cerro Pelon. There was a lot more monarchs, a lot more trees that had monarchs on them. There was also a lot more people. So it was a much more touristy type of a place. And so you can see there a lot of the people that were along the path. And they had the paths lined with string, if you can see there, so that people stayed on the path. They had some of their staff stationed along the path to make sure that people didn't cross the string, and they were also picking up monarchs that had landed in the pathway so that they didn't get trampled. So it was just a very different experience at this sanctuary, but there were so many more trees that had monarchs, and it was just amazing. You can see the clumps here in these pictures, and you can also just see there's a lot flying around. So they're not all just on the trees. There was a lot flying around us where we were. And so in this sanctuary, you could stand on the path and look in all directions all around you, and you would see these clumps of monarchs just hanging from the trees, from the trunks, just lining the trunks a lot of times. So there was just the sheer number of trees that had clumps of monarchs on them was amazing at this place. And they were, as I mentioned, they were flying all around us. This is my husband, Will. He had two that landed on him, and you can kind of see, you know, the crowds in the background too. Lots of Americans and visitors from overseas, but lots of Mexicans as well that come there to really appreciate the natural wonder that they have there in their country.
Kate wants to know if it causes any damage to the trees to have so many monarchs on them.
Not that I know of. And I should mention too, I mean, you know, monarchs are pretty light, so I don't think it might just kind of droop down some of the branches at the time, but then they just spring back after the monarchs leave. And a lot of times, especially in places like Cerro Pelon, they still come to that same mountain in Mexico each winter, but sometimes they will go to different places on the mountain. So it's not the same trees that get clusters on them every year. At a place like El Rosario, where there's just a lot more density, the same tree might get clusters each year, but I haven't heard of any issues with that.
A couple more questions for you in this batch. Penny says it looks like they're all tend to clump on a couple of different branches and then leave other branches bare. Is there any particular reason why?
I don't know about that, and sometimes they do move around on the tree itself. It may have to do with the sun exposure, and they may move from one side of the tree to the other within the course of a day. And when it's cold, they may just go to the ones that other monarchs are already on so that they can stay close together.
There's a question about how the monarchs are counted and how long are they there during the winter?
That's a great question. They are there, they usually come, the arrival has typically been on the Day of the Dead, which is our Halloween, October 31st. And they usually, March 20th, I think, was the day this year that they finally left Macheros in Mexico. So they're there for several months during the dry season in Mexico. And the other question, remind me, I just forgot the other question.
How are they counted?
How are they counted? Yeah, that's a very good question. And there's a lot of variability in that. With the graphs that I showed at the beginning, they were counted by the hectares of land where there were monarch clusters like this. And sometimes I've seen graphs with number of trees counted that have clusters on them. And it's just kind of estimated how many are actually on there. A few years ago, it was right before, maybe it was the winter of 2016, there was a bad ice storm in Mexico, and it hit the news that millions of monarchs were decimated. And so during that time, a lot of experts came and helped count the number of monarchs that died that year that were on the forest floor. And I can't remember the number that they came up with. And it was a staggering number, but they had never counted those before. So, and even when we were there, it was not icy cold, but there were some that had died that were laying on the ground. So, you know, just the data is a little, it's not consistent on that.
And then a couple of other questions. What time of year and when did you go?
I went in mid-January of 2017, and we just went. It was a long weekend. I think it was Martin Luther King weekend, and we had a really short timetable that we could go. We've got 3 kids at home, so we were trying to make it a short trip. So we flew in on Friday. We went to a sanctuary on Saturday, one on Sunday, and flew home on Monday. So, but we had a great experience, even though we were only there for 2 full days. But it was amazing. So.
And then one last question. Are birds or any other predators coming after the monarchs while they are in these trees?
For the most part, birds and other predators don't go after monarchs, or if they go after one, it's their last one because they don't taste good. They have a toxin in them because of that's in the milkweed. So as the caterpillars eat the milkweed, they absorb it into their body and they have that toxin. So the orange color that they have is a warning sign in nature. And so if a bird eats one monarch, depending on the bird, it may not kill it, but it doesn't taste good, and it probably doesn't make it feel very good. So for the most part, they don't have a lot of predators that will go after them. There are some predators of caterpillars and eggs at that stage, other insects, and you know, some birds will eat smaller caterpillars that maybe haven't built up enough of the toxin in them. So one issue, though, that they are facing in Mexico is illegal logging. And that's not logging companies that clear cut a whole area. It's usually individuals who are desperately poor, and they can go into the forest well, they shouldn't, but they have the ability, physical ability, to go into the forest and cut down a tree and sell it for food for their family, or maybe to build a better, rebuild their home or fix something at their home. So a few years ago, it was after we visited, Ellen and Joel started a nonprofit organization there in Mexico to be able to hire forest guardians. And they, for $6,000 a year for each full-time person, I think they have 4 or 5 guardians now that patrol the area and try to keep loggers out of there, and other people that might be destroying the habitat. So that's a serious issue there. Also, different, just clearing of the forest for different types of agriculture. This happens to be an avocado field, but of course other types of agriculture as well. Just take down the trees. And of course, you know, they need the crops, and they export a lot of the crops, which is also helps them to feed their family. So there's just a balance there, I guess, with the economic situation there, and the destruction of the monarch's habitat. So this is just, again, where we stayed, and we can send you this information afterwards as well. And so, you know, and just thinking about all of the issues that monarchs face, I know we're all thinking, what can we do? And we already talked about milkweed, and share a little bit more about that as well. I've had some people tell me, you know, that they bought monarchs and released them at a wedding, or, you know, those kinds of things, or even bought caterpillars for a classroom, or whatever it might be. And there's research that's showing that, because when you buy monarchs, either the butterflies or the caterpillars or eggs even, they come from a farm. And these farmed monarchs, since they were bred in captivity, they could spread diseases to the wild monarchs. They could be just less fit to survive in the wild. And it just also kind of gets in the way of scientists who are trying to study the wild monarchs. So we don't recommend buying farmed monarch butterflies or eggs or caterpillars, but just planting milkweed. Planting milkweed is a huge help. And also other types of nectar plants. And we have a list of those on our website as well. We'll send you the link. And because the adults need nectar throughout their whole migration and throughout their whole life, so as an adult, and of course then they need the milkweed for the other stages. So also limiting the use of insecticides, because especially sprayed insecticides will kill monarch eggs and caterpillars even in your yard. The mosquito sprays a lot of times will really impact pollinators of all types in our yards. So limiting any kind of sprayed insecticide as much as possible. We'll talk about citizen science and tagging in just a minute. And also, of course, spreading the word and telling everyone you know about the need to plant milkweed and nectar plants. So one school that I just want to highlight, and that's my husband sitting there. He's a 7th grade science teacher at Irmo Middle School. And several years ago, he calls it a garden. I kind of call it more of a milkweed field because it's very large. And you know, you don't need a huge space to grow milkweed, but in this area, they've really had a great success in growing lots of milkweed in here. And so in this picture, the orange you can see behind there is the butterfly weed, the tuberosa, with the really narrow leaves and orange flowers. And then the closer up photos are the syriaca with the really wide leaves, the common milkweed, and the big purple flower there on the top. And the one on the left is also a Syriaca. I think it's just faded a little bit. That's why it doesn't look purple. So they've planted all this milkweed at the school. And of course, if you plant it, they will come. So they've gotten lots of caterpillars here, and even seen adult monarchs laying the eggs in their garden. And this one is in that J shape, as I mentioned. So it's getting ready to form its chrysalis. So they have the whole life cycle right there in their garden at the school. And this is something that a lot of other schools are doing. It's a real easy, well, I shouldn't say easy. It takes a lot of work, but it's a great way to provide habitat for monarchs and really engage the students and the whole community, which I'll tell you about in a minute. So one thing that they realized off the bat with the students, the middle school students, was that they had to really teach them how to identify monarchs and contrast them with all the other orange butterflies that were coming into the garden. So the Gulf fritillaries in the top left, that's the top side of the wings and the underside of the wings. So those are both the same species. Those are the most common ones that we see really around. And then we have several of these other species of orange butterflies as well. Excuse me. So at the Irmo Middle Garden, they planted a lot of milkweed, but then they also had passion flower that just came in there naturally. So they ended up with caterpillars for the Gulf fritillaries and also the variegated fritillary as well, which also uses passion flower as its host plant. So do you have a question, Shannon? Oh, you're muted.
We have a couple, so we might want to go back a slide, just related to milkweed and growing. So let me start back up here. Does milkweed grow well when cut into clippings to regrow multiple plants?
I don't know anyone that's had success in doing that from cuttings. So taking the seed pods, the seeds that they produce is probably the best way to spread them around and to start them in pots.
And then Dave asked this question earlier, it fits in now, and he's got another question too. Is it too late to try and plant some milkweed in Charleston? What's generally the best time of year to plant that milkweed?
You can plant milkweed seeds in the spring, and they will probably be rather small the first year. They may not bloom the first year, but they will come back, and they will sometimes they'll put out a seed pod in the first year. It just kind of depends on the environment, but and then they'll drop seeds in the fall as well. And then also those same plants will come back in the spring. And after they've gone through a winter and that second growing season, they're a lot bigger and fuller, and generally will bloom after that and then going forward. So since they do drop the their seeds in the fall, you can also plant seeds in the fall, but they may not germinate until the spring. It depends on if we actually have a winter this year.
And on that same note, how much sun does the milkweed plant require?
Most of the milkweeds need a significant amount of sun. We have some at my house growing in rather shady areas, and they do grow and they do bloom, but they're not nearly as tall or as full as the ones in full sun.
And then Don asked how to get milkweed from SCWF. We do generally give out milkweed seeds. I believe we are mostly out of stock for this season, but we'll send out the links to our pages for milkweed, and then just keep checking back. We'll open up registration for that as soon as we've got packets available. Let's see. There are a few more questions. Katie says, I have common milkweed coming up on its own like an aggressive weed. It doesn't flower yet. The plant gets tall and looks healthy. Any thoughts? I get about 5 hours of sun.
Well, I've heard that, especially about common milkweed, that sometimes it may take a couple years for it to flower. But really it's, the main thing that it's needed for is those leaves for the caterpillars. As long as you have other nectar plants nearby, then you will have, you're providing good habitat for the monarchs.
And then as you continue on to your next slides, Pat did ask, and you may answer this in a moment, what does the loss of the monarch mean for us?
Okay. Well, I think just in general, everything's connected in nature. And so kind of like a spider web, I guess, that's all connected. And if you pull any one piece, then every other pieces in that web, the web of nature, are all affected. So losing any species is a huge issue that we need to face, and that wildlife that's really going to affect a lot of different species of wildlife. And so and they are pollinators, so just losing another pollinator could affect some of our food sources, some of the crops that we need as food. So it's definitely something that we and lots of other people and organizations across the country are very concerned about. And so another way that we can help is with citizen science. And this is a way that everybody could get involved with researching about monarchs and helping the scientists and conservationists, wildlife biologists learn more about the monarch populations, where they're going, when they're getting there, any changes, so that we can be ready to up conservation efforts in certain areas or move them around if that's where the monarchs are going. So Journey North, just like Christmas bird count and some of the other, like Frog Watch, where you count other species, Journey North is the one for monarchs. And so through that you can get little tags. If you've ever seen like bird tagging, they usually have like a little bracelet that goes on their foot. But with monarch tags, that's not really possible. So they have this little sticker that has the phone number for Journey North and an individual tag number on it. And so that helps researchers, if that butterfly is recovered somewhere else, it helps researchers to know where our populations are going. So this is at Irmo Middle School. They've taken on this tagging program, and this is a little homemade enclosure in the middle. That's actually wedding veil, bridal veil tool that is just fastened onto a cardboard disc, and they just use that to hold the monarchs, keep them all together, keep them from flying away while they are doing their tagging. So they get all the students involved there, and they have data sheets and they collect the tag number and the date. They teach them how to identify males and females and the location of where they tagged them. And so, and this cardboard with the rubber band on it, the clothespins, these are pretty typical ways that butterflies and monarchs especially are held still so that the tags can be placed on them in the right way. And it doesn't hurt the butterfly at all. It keeps them safer because it keeps their wings together and keeps them from moving around so that they don't get injured while if you're trying to just hold on to one wing or something. So a lot of the students get involved in applying those tags as well. It goes on the same spot on that section of the monarch at each time. And so then the hope is that those, like I mentioned, those tagged monarchs are recovered somewhere else. If they're recovered in South Florida in December, then we know, that tells us something, that they're not necessarily going to Mexico, or maybe they're recovered in Mexico. And then, so, just having that information is very important. Anybody can go to Journey North and order some tags, and you can take this on yourself. They have butterfly nets, so they capture adults that come and visit the garden, adult monarchs that come and visit the garden for tagging. And they also capture caterpillars, and then after they emerge from the chrysalis, they then they can tag them after a day, after they've dried out, after a day or so. So it's at Irmo Middle School, and this, as I mentioned, this is something that could be applied at any school. They've really worked to incorporate the monarchs across the whole curriculum. So it's not just the science classes, but several other teachers in their team that are all working together to teach about monarchs in these different disciplines. So, for example, with social studies, mapping of the monarch migration patterns. There's also a book that's called The Butterfly, and it's about the use of monarchs to memorialize children of the Holocaust. So they read that book while they're learning about World War II. So there are different ways, those are some different ways that the social studies class gets involved. The math classes help collect data, measuring and figuring out perimeter and area of the garden, things like that, analyzing data, scale drawings. Of course, monarchs are beautiful, so they're great subjects for the art classes. And also butterfly wings are symmetrical. So just in learning about symmetry and, some of the other aspects and using a butterfly for, to really recreate in your art. Got a question?
Yeah, Becca asked, is it okay to take a caterpillar with its milkweed inside to observe its change in chrysalis and then release it, or should they be left alone?
It is okay to take them in and keep milkweed. We usually discourage taking in a lot of caterpillars. Having them having a lot of them in an enclosed space could help. If there's a disease, it could help spread, having them just that close together. So a really well ventilated indoor area would be good. And making sure they have milkweed, like I mentioned, and then after it comes out, you can release it outside. So that's a good way to do that. It's a really good educational tool for kids as well, to be able to see that whole process.
And we did have one question from earlier. I know we're getting close to that hour mark. They just asked how to tell the difference between a male and a female monarch.
Okay, let me see if I see. Okay, this tagged one here is a female on the left. And if you can, I think this one's hard to see. Where's my mouse? Right here, there's usually a little black spot that is is just a little bit bigger than the straight across line. You can see there's no black spot here. I keep going the wrong way. So, so having that little black spot there, and it's easier to see on the outside of the wings as well, that means it's a male. So not having that means it's a female. Okay, social studies, math, art. So language arts is another area, of course, that just having the kids read about some of the studies, and also creating brochures or writing class poems, things like that, There are several, of course, very scientific papers, news articles. There's a scientific paper about monarchs that at Irmo Middle School that they incorporate in as well. And of course, there's tons of science connections as well with inquiry and data analysis, looking at milkweed plant cells under the microscope, and even a little more in depth in talking about some of the genetics of monarchs, and then genetic engineering when we talk about crops. They even compare the monarch digestive and respiratory systems with the humans in their human body units. And then, of course, with their greenhouse, there are lots of studies on soil and also lots of other ecological connections that they can make with the whole butterfly life cycle. So they have a huge greenhouse at Irmo Middle School, and they plant lots of milkweed each year. They put some of these in the garden right there at their school, but they also have a plant sale each year for the community, for parents in the community. And they also give, they sell some of the milkweed to garden centers so that they can turn it around for their customers. And then also giving some milkweed away to the local town and to be able to put into the parks there in their community. So they've done seed packets, and of course, as we mentioned, we at the Wildlife Federation do seed packets as well. So it's a great partnership to get the word out in the community. They've also presented to town council, which is a really cool experience for the kids to see how a town council meeting works, but it's great really to educate the leaders of your local area as well about what the students are up to and what your own town might be able to do to help our wildlife populations. So this is in Irmo here, this man is our head maintenance guy for the town, Whit Klein, and some of the students presenting him with milkweed and signs to be able to put up at our community parks. And it works. So this is some milkweed at our local community parks with the caterpillars on it there. So of course, like I mentioned, it's just so important to really spread the word about getting more milkweed, more nectar plants, limiting the use of pesticides and herbicides also, because that's affecting the milkweed as well. So, and then of course also the impact that it has if it's in a school setting on the students and the student learning and having this kind of project that they can all really have ownership and buy-in from. So I can take more questions now. I also promised you some show and tell here. So I'll stop sharing my screen so you can see me a little bit bigger. This is a milkweed. This is the common milkweed seed pod. And you can see it's quite large. It's just about the size of, a little bigger than my palm. And this one's still closed up. And so it will start getting these in the summer, late summer, and then open up in the fall. This is a different species, but this is what it looks like on the inside. This is the incarnata, the swamp milkweed. And so there's the line of seeds down the middle there, and they are all connected. This is another piece of that same seed pod with this white fuzzy material here. And so each seed has that fuzzy material on it so that it can float around in the wind and really disperse away from the mother plant so that it can just grow and spread throughout your garden. And now I've got white stuff flying around in my office and seeds on my desk. But anyways, so I just wanted to show you a little show and tell. These are from the Irmo Middle garden that just we just got this week. So they're starting to have seed pods. Some of these are a little bit older, but any other questions at this point?
It was pointed out your question slide actually had a good picture of the male monarch if you wanted to pull that last page
Okay.
up. And then one question was in regards to mating. They asked the male, does the female attract the male or is it vice versa?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know that answer.
And
Maybe just find each other, just like we do.
we can look that up and include it in the follow-up to the webinar as well.
Yes, these are the spots I was talking about when I find my cursor right here that make it a male.
Doesn't look like we have any other questions. We'll give you about, let's see. Don wants to know how many eggs a monarch lays.
I don't know that either. I know some other species of butterflies will lay like a whole, either a line or it might be a whole cluster of them together. But the monarch does lay individual eggs, and sometimes they'll be on different leaves, or they might be on the same leaf, or they hop around to different plants right there in your garden. So I don't know the number, but I don't know. I would guess that it's several dozen at a time, but I'm not sure about that one.
Yeah, and Dave actually was helpful and said that a male will force a female to mate with them. He got that from DNR, and DNR is one of our very trusted partners.
Yes.
We can trust. Dennis asked if you know how many generations it takes to make a complete round trip to Mexico.
I think that the consensus is 4 generations. There's some debate about whether there's actually a 5th generation. So I mentioned that they mate in Mexico, and then they, especially the females, will fly up to Texas, lay eggs, and then they die. And then that new generation, so it kind of depends on where you start counting your generations. So that's a new generation. So they will start, once those become butterflies, then they will fly up to, a couple states higher, maybe the Midwest, and lay their eggs and then die. So those generations are very short-lived. They'll only live for a couple of weeks, maybe a month in between there, and then as they're migrating north. And then up in the northernmost parts of the United States and up into Canada is where the final generation, the migrating generation, is born and hatches out from their eggs. And then once the butterflies come out of the chrysalis, then they begin the migration to Mexico or south, wherever they go. So that super generation, they call it, those butterflies are actually a little bit bigger, a couple millimeters bigger, and stronger, people say, and they last, I guess, from September to March or April, when they get back into the United States in the spring. So, so it's a very complicated process, and but it's just amazing to show the adaptations of that species.
And Janet asked, what season are the eggs laid in? So is that happening now, spring?
Well, it depends on where you are. And here, we get a lot of eggs and caterpillars in late August and September. So where that fits in what I just described, that's part of why we really need to tag monarchs in South Carolina, is because we're not really sure. We're not in the Midwest. And so we're not really sure how the monarchs that come through South Carolina fit into that big migration. But we usually have some eggs laid in the spring, April, May timeframe, but a lot more caterpillars. We get a lot of calls for milkweed, and where can I find some more milkweed, because all my caterpillars ate everything. So those calls usually start coming in September.
And then one question regarding a clarification, is it one generation that migrates south and overwinters?
Yes, yes. So that's the super generation, that those eggs are laid in the upper part of their migration route. So northern United States and Canada. And then after they have their chrysalis and they go through metamorphosis, those are the ones that migrate all the way to Mexico or Florida or South Carolina, wherever they go, and then back up to lay eggs in the spring. So that super generation lives about 6 months, whereas opposed to the other generations throughout the summer that are migrating north only live a couple of weeks to a month.
Very good. That's it for questions right now.
Okay, great. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Yes.
We're glad to have all of you.
And I'm going to drop the link one more time for our auction. Please check it out and support these education classes. We've loved having so many free webinars. So if you get on and purchase a fun trip, you go birding with Jay Keck, who is on our staff on Lake Murray. We've got a lot of fun options there. So check it out. And otherwise, we will see you for one of our upcoming webinars.
Thank you, everyone.